This is Christ and Questions. Today my question is, why do I personally have different reactions to the Canaanite genocide of the book of Joshua, and the Neo-Assyrian war crimes of the Iron Age, and the modern genocide of modern Assyrians by Muslim governments and religious leaders? Now, this is sort of a spin-off of the Oldest Stories podcast. Right now over there we have been going through the Assyrian Empire and their astonishingly brutal expansion, but have by this point in the show made mention of all three of the mass killings that we'll be discussing today. A lot of today's topic is colored by my own personal feelings, which seem morally inconsistent. So this is partly going to be a personal exploration for me to figure out why I feel like these three incidents have different moral content. But hopefully it will also be a scripture-based examination of mass slaughter. Now, will YouTube take this down for being about genocide? Got no idea. Here we go anyway. In a recent episode over on the Oldest Stories podcast, episode 144, Call of Kalhu, I brought up the city of Kalhu, sometimes called Nimrud or Kala, because we looked at the city's founding in 879 BCE by Ashurnasirpal II. Link in the description for the full episode on that. And you'll see that that wasn't actually that recent of an episode. This has taken me a long time to put together, mostly in terms of working out what exactly is going on in my own mind, and things like just war theory, and it's just taken a long time. But I couldn't avoid mentioning in that particular episode where the city of Kalhu is today. And that is that the vast majority of the ongoing archaeological work there has now ended, because over 90% of the site was destroyed in 2014 and 2015 by the Islamic State while they were the government of that region. And in my ongoing research into the ancient Assyrians, I keep running across more and more reminders that their descendants, the modern Assyrians, have been actively and intensively genocided since 915. That's CE, in the modern era. The last three caliphs of Islam, that would be Mehmet V, Mehmet VI, and Abdul-Mehjid II, spent a good amount of their time ethnically cleansing what was left of the crumbling Ottoman Empire of non-Muslims. The Greeks, Jews, and Armenians slaughtered and displaced are, of course, the most well-known from this, and it's often called the first genocide. And I don't want to take anything away from them or the other groups that were also affected by all this, but since my focus on the historical show has been ancient Assyria, the killings and subjugation of modern Assyrians has been my focus in all of this. And the destruction of Kalhu almost became a large rant at the end of that episode, some of which I've pulled out and cleaned up a bit for this episode, because on that episode it really needed to stay about history as much as possible, and as much as the destruction of Kalhu is important to note in the story of that city, it would take away from the history to let it overwhelm the episode. But of course, the modern destruction of Kalhu wasn't special in some wider sense, except in how little practical value it had compared to how much cultural value had been extracted archaeologically from the site. I mean, those same Muslims attacked Assyrian towns and villages all throughout the Assyrian heartland of northern Iraq and the Khabur region of Syria. These same places where we've been seeing the ancient Assyrian Empire establish itself in these last few episodes. And as the population of these villages has been driven out in modern times, which Caliph Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi justified with an explicit reference to the Quran, Surah 9, verse 29, among others from the Quran and Hadith, Those who were not able to flee were either slaughtered or taken as sex slaves, which is another Quranic practice where such women are called those whom your right hands possess. Once the people are cleared out and the horrors of war have swept through the community, Islamic State often stayed behind to destroy the cultural heritage of the communities for no particular reason, we'll say. Churches burned, medieval settlements destroyed, museums pillaged, and archaeological sites bulldozed. Places of no military value destroyed in the name of Allah, because the non-believers must be fought until they feel themselves subjugated. That is, of course, Quran 9:29, and no Muslim should leave any image standing without defacing it, or any built-up grave site without leveling it. That's the Quran, Sahih Muslim 969. That's not the Quran, that's the Sunnah, Sahih Muslim 969. Outside of the Islamic State, though, we saw prior to the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan the Taliban's systematic destruction of ancient Buddhist and Hindu sites in that region, culminating in the famous destruction of the Bamiyan Buddhas, which was about the only site in all of that destruction that the Western media seemed to care about. Though when I did look through Hindu newspapers, they've been agonizing over the loss of their holy places in Muslim territory for a very long time prior to this. Even in India itself, not Afghanistan and Pakistan, triumphal mosques still stand atop former Hindu holy sites where the former temples were demolished and the worshippers and priests were ceremoniously sometimes dismembered, buried under where the Muslims now walk when they're on their way to prayer, so that every time the Muslims at that mosque walk to their prayers, they are walking over the destroyed holy remains and just bones of their victims. Because, of course, the Muslims not only love to destroy the heritage of their conquered peoples, but they really love to celebrate atop the holy sites of places that aren't really holy to them. Most famous of these is the Dome of the Rock, a site with only a much later fabricated connection to Muhammad, which was built centuries later after the conquest of Jerusalem to celebrate victory over the hated Jews, only then coming to be named Al-Aqsa Mosque to tie it to Quran Surah 17's vague and nonsensical tale of Muhammad being carried off in some sort of spiritual nonsense vision. Anyway, following the U.S. surrender in Afghanistan, Islamic government and Sharia law has returned in that country, with captured U.S. equipment and explosives now being used to destroy archaeological sites that are identified but often unexcavated or lightly excavated at the rate of about one per week. They would go faster, but they're operating with limited resources in destroying one of the most historically important and poorly understood crossroads of the ancient world. These sites may have been where the Bronze Age tin came from, and the destruction is at such a level at this point that we may now never understand the people and kingdoms that played such a crucial role in ancient development and trade. More important than places is people, and as Islamic State fighters took some of the towns of the modern Assyrians, as well as when they conquered towns from others who they considered to be apostates and kafir, they emulated their prophet. In 627 CE, when Muhammad won the Battle of the Trench, which was a siege of Medina as part of his expulsion of the Banu Quraysh and the Banu Nadir, the Jews of the region, he moved to the Qurayza town and the people surrendered. This was, up to this point in this section, a fairly standard bit of military action, at which point Muhammad rounded them all up. He enslaved all of the children, he took the women as sex slaves, and he grouped the men into groups of 10. Taking each group separately to the market, the traditional Muslim biographers report that Muhammad and a group of loyal men forced each group of Jews to dig a trench. Then once that trench was deep enough, he lined the 10 men on the edge of the trench they had just dug, he cut their throats, and he threw them in the pit. This was repeated, group of 10 after group of 10, until somewhere between 600 and 900 surrendered captives had been killed. This historical example was notably followed by Islamic State in the modern era, though on larger scale with industrial killing machines, since they could take men in much larger groups, force them all to dig their own mass graves, then mow them down in those graves with automatic weapons. These men, in both cases, ancient and modern, had died seeing their children carried off in slave wagons to the Syrian slave markets. These men had seen their wives and daughters taken as sex slaves of the Islamic fighters. And having grown up in a Muslim culture, it's hard to think that those Assyrians gunned down in 2014 and 2015 did not know the story of how Muhammad had concluded the Battle of the Trench, as they themselves were forced to dig. Islamic State no longer holds power in that broad region. They certainly aren't wholly defeated, but they aren't the power they once were. The ruins of the ruins are now held by the nominally secular Iraqi government and, according to some reports, also defended by militia made up of modern Assyrians. Some attempts are being made to salvage what can be salvaged from the site of Kalhu, but Islamic State was not an aberration in its destruction of heritage. The Assyrians, Armenians, and many others have been persecuted at a fever pitch in the last century or more, and the wide Islamic movements have smashed museums and bulldozed archaeological sites under the Taliban in Afghanistan, during the reign of Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, against Hindu people in places in Pakistan and northern India, and many other places throughout the Near East, with minimal condemnation. The worldwide unrest of October 2023 showed us that the global Muslim community is interested in celebrating when groups emulate the Prophet Muhammad, executing lightning raids to slaughter unwary civilians and capture sex slaves. But the silence over the Muslim persecution of Assyrians shows that they hesitate to condemn people who are emulating the Prophet Muhammad in his destruction of the non-believers and their idolatrous ancestral sites. The Assyrian genocide hasn't ended, and not that many months ago there was a story in the news about an Assyrian Christian bishop living in Australia who was attacked with a knife in the middle of a church service by a man shouting Allahu Akbar. That man's motivations are officially unknown. For an Australian Muslim to so despise an Australian Assyrian, both of them on the opposite side of the world from any possible territorial claims, reminds us that this is nothing less than ideological, nothing less than the result of a holy book which reads, "Kill the polytheists wherever you find them, capture them, besiege them, and lie in wait for them on every way. Only if they convert are they to be spared." For the people of the book, the prescription is, fight those who do not believe in Allah and the last day, nor comply with what Allah and his messengers have forbidden, nor embrace the religion of truth. For these, there is the third option, besides death and conversion, the famous dhimmi status, which involves crushing taxation and regulation explicitly designed to cause the dhimmis to feel at all times like they are subjugated, such as it varies historically from place to place, but they've done humiliating hairstyles, strong prohibitions against maintaining community buildings, sometimes even bans on wearing shoes. Dhimmis is a topic you can get a whole lot into. Now, does every Muslim live like the men of Islamic State? or the Saudi Holy Enforcers, or the Taliban fighters, or Boko Haram, or the Chechen Mujahideen, or the Islamic Revolutionary Guards, or the Bangasmoro Army, or the Wilati al-Hisba, or the Muslim Tigers of Assam, or the Muslim Brotherhood, or Al-Shabaab, or the 80 million worldwide members of Tablighi Jamaat? No, of course not. Most Muslims live in peace with their neighbors. The question is as ridiculous as asking if every Christian lives their lives in accordance with the Bible. The difference is that the closer a Christian models himself after Jesus, and the more a Christian follows the laws of God, the more peaceful and self-sacrificing he'll become, filled with love towards his fellow man. The more a Muslim follows Quran and Sunnah, however, modeling his life after Muhammad, the closer they will come to a man who married a 9-year-old, beat his wives, tortured men for their treasure, slaughtered those who left his group, killed even a nursing woman with a child at her chest who had written a satirical poem about him, who burned with hate against the Jews, polytheists, and scoffers of every stripe. This being the case, the common refrain in the West that we should promote moderate Islam seems all the more craven and disrespectful. We should not support those who are weak in their faith to be weaker in their faith. We should bring them out of such a wicked faith, preferably bring them to Jesus, but frankly, pretty much into anything else, be it atheism, nihilism, Hinduism, or voodoo. There is no major faith among the world religions as destructive as Islam. Only the Aztec faith could have rivaled it in the days of their own mass slaughters, and the Aztecs have been reduced now to an historical curiosity. I'm a bit off topic at this point, and I know that, and that's how it goes, but the truth is that this violence has come against even me. Not in a huge way. I'm a pretty tiny podcaster with a minimal voice. I get very few comments and emails in general, consistent with my low viewership numbers, and that's fine. But when my tiny volume of comments turns into a tiny volume of condemnations and threats for mentioning the Muslim genocide of the Assyrians, including a threat that I will be shown what Mohammed does to critics, it astonishes me in how far they're going to go after such a small target. These anonymous commentators are impotent, but the vile maliciousness of men who consider a caravan robber to be the model for all men must be called out by those who have a voice. It's only when they're appeased that they're happy. It's only when the truth is silent that they can terrify the world. And it was those that turned me from just, grumbling about it and being bothered by the evil they represent in the world to writing a segment all about the evils of Islam. But the point in all this is that I get a bit bothered by all of this, especially by the modern genocide against the Assyrian people. You could call me somewhat emotional about the topic, and yet I've already made an episode over on the Oldest Stories podcast where I took another genocide, the Israelite genocide of the Canaanites, and I declared that to be morally good. In fact, I pointed out over on the Oldest Stories podcast that the Israelite genocide was not a complete genocide, and many of the victims were ultimately allowed to live. And it is that incompleteness which I declared to be morally bad in Joshua's persecution of the genocide. Well, it isn't really me who declared it as such. It is God himself in Scripture who condemned Joshua and the Israelites for not fully slaughtering the Canaanites, and God himself in Scripture who notes that this is what will ultimately lead to the downfall of Israel. And sure enough, can you imagine it? God was correct. It did lead to the downfall of Israel. I won't get into the full historical details of the Canaanite genocide here. Those who check out the multiple episodes touching on it, check the Israel playlist down in the comments, or the description somewhere. Those who see those episodes, you'll see that I'm generally quite bullish about the historicity of the account. But the important part here, for the ethical question, is the narrative flow that the Holy Spirit has presented us in Scripture. That is to say, whether or not the Canaanite genocide is an historical account, God wanted to present us with the story as we have it. And that story is, Joshua shows up for the land, ready for a standard bit of conquering, when an angel of the Lord, who is a super significant character and possibly the pre-incarnate Jesus, shows up to Joshua and says, "No, don't just conquer these people, absolutely slaughter them." Then, during the course of the campaign, Joshua and his men sometimes decide to, let's not slaughter everything we find, and every time they do that, they're condemned for it, with God telling them they did wrong by not killing everything. As I pointed out at length on the other show, you can't get around this by saying it isn't historical, because even if it isn't, the narrative is one of God continually pressing for a total annihilation of a people, with the people themselves being imperfect instruments of God's will. Now, comparing all of this with the Muslim genocides in the modern era, there's a camp that will say that one of these incidents is justified, while the other is terribly evil, because one of these has the sanction of God, and the other is an act of evil men who are compounding their evil with the blasphemous statement that God has commanded their wickedness. The great thing here is that this exact perspective can be held to support one or the other of these two genocides, the modern or the historical. Still, despite the fact that on its face it seems to be an invalid argument because of this very symmetry, there's a part of me that's quite sympathetic to this idea. After all, if God exists and knows everything and is fully good, then it would surely be within his rights to command a killing on pretty much any scale, knowing as he would that the badness of the killing would be less bad, the least bad option, or that it would serve some higher purpose, or simply that benevolence requires excising certain evils the way bodily health requires the removal of a cancerous tumor. And in truth, the two cases, the Muslim genocide and the Israelite genocide in Canaan, are not in fact mirrors of each other. When looking only at the moral question, we can wiggle our assumptions around as we play philosopher as much as we want. But in actual fact, we would presumably be deciding on the existence and nature of God long before we started deciding whether or not we should kill in his name. And it just so happens that the Bible is factually correct in its representations of God and his will, while Islam is false and wicked. And if that is all there is to say about it, the moral issue pretty much vanishes in the face of the metaphysical issue, and then the matter becomes pretty simple. I approve of the biblical genocides because they're approved by God, who says that the people of Canaan are wicked and deserve punishment, while I disapprove of the modern genocide because it's committed by people who have perverted the very idea of God against good, faithful Christians. And part of why I've had such a hard time in pondering this is that while I do think this holds to a certain degree, it is a very unsatisfying answer, and it raises a whole host of problems about how we know when God is speaking to us and when we're simply deluded. But there is a third case, which shows that there's more to it than this. Consider the ancient Assyrians, from whom the modern Assyrians ultimately derive. Over on the Oldest Stories podcast, as I've said, we've been covering their conquests for a number of episodes now. So far, they've been able to, with minimal resistance, bully anyone in the Near East that they want to. Their unstoppability will face occasional interruption, but their cruelty will not. Many of their conquests were what we would consider to be fairly conventional in terms of ancient Near Eastern warfare. Pretty rough, but comparable with what other nations would do to each other. They just happened to be the ones winning more often than not. But when they had a particular motivation against a certain city, either that nation had been disrespectful or rebellious or resisted harder than normal, or it might not even be the city. Maybe the Assyrian king just felt like an example needed to be made for the region. The Assyrians would do astonishingly horrible things to these people. Once the walls of a city were breached, the army would devolve into smaller and smaller units, fanning out through the streets with the explicit goal of pacifying resistance, but with the implicit goal of gaining their service rewards. Those service rewards included any material goods they saw which they felt like taking, any people that they felt like enslaving, usually to be sold after the battle for personal profit, and any sexual assault they felt like committing against any women they could get their hands on. In order to get their hands on these things, they murdered and maimed those who resisted or those who got in their way, and destroyed any objects they felt like destroying. After a certain period, which would vary based on how much the commander wanted to punish the city, the troops would be brought back under control and the people of the city would be assembled. Many would already have been caught trying to escape, though some would, of course, would still manage to escape or hide through all of this. Then, by random selection perhaps, or maybe based on certain categories sometimes, all the people of the city that could be assembled would be divided into up to 5 groups. The first group would be publicly tortured in a variety of painful ways. Some would be flayed alive for their skin to be used in creative tapestries. Some would be impaled upon spikes where they would take hours to die. Some would be thrown atop bonfires and burned alive en masse. Some would be dismembered or blinded. Other creative options existed as well. The next group would be executed in cold blood, their heads chopped off. This was usually the fighting men, either soldiers or soldier candidates, and often their heads would be cut off and then assembled into towers, while the blood was allowed to pool into rivers or lakes, turning the water red as a warning for those downstream. The next group would be stripped naked and enslaved, bound in ropes, and marched back to the markets of Nineveh for a life of degradation and abuse. The fourth group, usually the luckiest, though they wouldn't realize it for a while, would be deported elsewhere into the empire, forced to start a new life in a new location. And the fifth group would be left in the city. After all of this, or sometimes during this, the city would often be lit on fire and allowed to burn past the ability of ancient peoples to control it. This is, of course, a very simplified and generic overview. Each case would have been somewhat different, but that's the general idea. And somehow, while recognizing that the people subjected to this treatment are absolutely undergoing something to make most horror movies look like children's cartoons, I managed to approach it most of the time with a fairly even-handed and neutral perspective. Now, this is partly the historical voice that I try and keep in the Oldest Stories podcast at all times, but there's more to it than just that. I think I'm genuinely not as upset about the ancient Assyrian slaughters as I am about the modern genocides. And to a certain extent, I am as bothered by that apparent inconsistency as much as I'm bothered by anything else, which is why I'm making this whole episode. It's not the genocide word. The big G, I throw that word around a lot, but I genuinely don't think that genocide actually qualifies as a special class of crime. It does have definitions, but the practical definition is pretty fuzzy. I'm fine with it as an idea, but look, killing and plundering and torturing and enslaving and so on, these are all terrible things. These are all crimes. And there's something remarkable about doing any or all of these things in large scales that even magnifies the crime beyond merely adding one death atop another. But the addition of genocide means very little in my opinion. When the ancient Assyrians target a region of, say, Urartians, they destroy quite a lot and replace it with their own way of doing things to the extent that they feel like it. But in fact, they neither desired to nor thought it was possible to completely exterminate the nation of Urartu, and thus never actually qualify as genocidal even at their most destructive. And I don't just mean against Urartu, against the Aramaeans, against the Neo-Hittites, against all the little Zagros peoples that they attacked. They're not trying to wipe out a culture, they're just trying to pacify, conquer, and plunder a region, which makes it not genocide. The modern Muslim assault on the modern Assyrians is also extremely destructive, but it has the explicit goal that all Christians should be removed from Muslim lands, and thus is clearly genocidal. And yet the actual actions themselves are relatively similar when looked at from the victim's perspective, allowing for differences in technology and military fashion. Cultures, you see, a culture, it lives, it dies, and it shifts constantly. And while as an historian I want to preserve the stories of these people, I don't necessarily weep for what is lost so much as for what is forgotten. The Assyrian culture of the Iron Age would be dead today whether or not that empire had collapsed. Same for the Urartians, the Neo-Hittites, the little Zagros peoples. Just as the Chinese culture today is alien to that of the Qin dynasty. Peaceful cultural transitions are to be preferred over violent ones, but that's only because peace is usually better than violence. It's just how it is. The bringing to decide the destruction of a culture is a uniquely bad thing, beyond the destruction of all the people and stuff and memory that implies. I don't think that's legitimate. I really don't. So the difference isn't, in my mind, one of genocide, though it may be a related matter. It feels like the modern persecution is far more angry than the ancient wars. This is, of course, a function of distance. I can watch jihadi videos on Telegram, and back in the day I could watch them on LiveLeak, but all that we have for these ancient slaughters is just official state propaganda and occasional archaeological artifacts. So that likely affects my personal reaction to each, but it's not a valid reason to judge them differently. Part of it might also be that the Muslim attacks are ongoing right now, whereas, the ancient Assyrians certainly aren't attacking anybody. Ashurnasirpal hasn't killed anybody in 2,800 years or more. Math is hard, I don't know. And that might be part of the emotional reaction. But I don't think it's valid as a moral reaction. But what I would suggest, and I know this has gotten both very personal and very long, but the best I can come up with is this. The means and motives of all three genocides that we've discussed today are quite similar. Joshua's Hebrews slaughtered whole towns. The ancient Assyrians slaughtered whole towns plus some added torture. The modern caliphate brought industrial weapons to the same slaughter. All three of them justified it by recourse to their god. But what's most striking is the results of each. The thing that was left after the storm of horror had passed over the land. In the case of modern ISIS, or the other Muslim genocides of the modern age, the corpses are buried, the homes demolished, the rich histories annihilated, and in most cases all that's left is a dead, empty patch of sand. The Islamic civilizations of the Near East have underperformed by every civilizational metric since the modern era, having conquered some of the richest lands of the earth, yet now ruling over one of the poorest, mired by corruption, hemorrhaging refugees, and home to the last and largest slave markets of the modern era. Islam itself glorifies the most evil founder of any major world religion, and his pattern of conduct is stamped upon the region, leaving it fettered in all places where the inborn moral compasses of the people are overwhelmed by their unfounded faith. While there are worse places on earth than the modern Near East, there are no sicker civilizations, only places more overwhelmed by disorder and poverty. In the case of the ancient Assyrian Empire, however, one of the most striking things is the abrupt transition across the Assyrian border. It was official state policy to divide the whole world into Mat Asher and everywhere else, seeing everywhere else as worthy of nothing but violence and forcible submission. Once you enter the land of Asher, however, matters changed rapidly. Cities who had been subjected to brutal sieges and post-conquest devastations were, if they were brought into the empire fully, which some places were not, they would be rebuilt with state funds and given equitable tax rates along the lines of the heartland provinces. Those forcible mass deportations always began in violence, but once the people reached their destination, they were frequently given all the equipment, training, and assistance they needed to build new lives, being so fully integrated into the empire after a generation or two that it's nearly impossible to figure out in the late period which communities had been of the Sabu class in the early period. It was still an Iron Age kingdom, a despotism enforced at spear point with slavery and some decidedly non-modern attitudes to most of life, but so was everywhere else at the time. And looking at the broad sweep of the region at that time, life was pretty good if you were inside the Assyrian Empire without any ambitions to exit it. The empire always had flaws, both by modern and ancient standards, and due in large part to those failings, it proved to be extremely fragile. But there was some genuine good to balance against the hard darkness, and a decent case to be made that the cruelty was instrumental in obtaining that light. It wasn't optimal, but when do we humans manage optimal? Turning into our third case, Israel is a mixed bag here. The conquest of Canaan, by the standards of what we've been talking about, was relatively gentle. The biblical account tells us only 3 cities were put to the torch, and the archaeological record supports the idea that few destruction layers can be dated to cities at this time. The conquests were meant to make way for the Israelites to enter and occupy what existed, not to destroy and reconstruct, as the Old Testament narrative makes clear. And what results is a set of tribal structures, and later a kingdom, which is so much like the people that they displaced that it's hard to tell them apart archaeologically. So in the analysis of what actually happened, the matter was about as gentle as ancient war can be, and the benefits were minimal. Not none. It can't really be underestimated, the benefits of more godly people displacing less godly folk, and the gradual elimination of child sacrifice is surely a notable plus, as the Kingdom of Israel gradually tried to improve themselves in ways that their pagan neighbors would never even think to attempt. So it's hard to get too upset about the Canaanite conquest as it actually happened, as it was about as good a thing as ancient war could get. And ancient war was typically far less destructive than modern war, unless there was a concerted effort going on to put into the post-battle war crimes. But of course, the things that gets us all worked up about the Canaanite genocide is that the conquest shouldn't have been a conquest at all. It should have been a genocide. God is extremely irritated at his chosen people for their failure to slaughter uniformly and universally. God's instructions to Joshua were to leave the fields and buildings standing to the greatest extent possible, but to melt down the idols, execute the men, women, and children, and sacrifice all the animals. This, by the way, is the first genocidal call known to history. The first time that the goal was the actual removal of an entire people, since those people were tainted and the culture irredeemable. I'm not going to justify that statement that God is right and the Canaanites are wrong. I don't do apologetics here, but if we assume the Bible is true, that has to be where we come from, that there should have been a genocide here. And it just so happens the fact that the genocide wasn't complete means that Israel was, in fact, tainted by Canaanite cultural practices. And in the grand arc of Old Testament historical narrative it'll all be Israel working as a people to repair that taint of intermixing, which is why the last historical event of the last historical book is the people of Israel divorcing their polytheistic wives or being expelled from the community. The final separation, which would ensure the survival of Israel as a unique culture tied to Yahweh before he closed the book on that part of the canon. Just as people debate whether God intended for Adam and Eve to stay in the garden, or if he knew they would fall and built that into his plans, it isn't clear if God actually expected the full genocide to be carried out, or knew that it would be tempered by the people's mix of greed, mercy, and laziness, and set out the historical plan of Israel with that in mind. Just as in the garden, we can imagine, sort of, a perfectly godly community within the bounds of the Holy Land serving as a shining example for the nations. Had that been built upon the bones of the wicked dead, it seems like that would have been worthwhile. The death of the Canaanite children would have prevented them from spawning further sinful generations, and bringing them up to God, and making way for something that would have truly been a shining city on a hill. It is an image that deserves far more pondering than a mention at the end of a long episode, but it gets us all to the point of the whole matter. By their fruits you shall know them. We've looked at 3 genocides today. Torture, murder, plunder, enslavement. These are all terrible things, and the immediate supposition should be that anyone who uses them is suspect. But the truth is, we've only looked at 3 today, but nearly every kingdom, nation, and empire is founded upon the bones of those who opposed it. And it seems unchristian to think that all nations should be opposed at all times. Christ said, "Submit to the earthly authorities," who at the time were the Romans, a people who had destroyed a fair share of enemies with fire and sword, men who kept order with an iron fist at times. It's not illegitimate in Christian thought to have or defend a national order, though this is something that needs to be pondered in a future episode. Scripture is, by modern accounts, very shockingly even-handed about the wars of nations. Sometimes it treats them as simply things that happen, or sometimes as something akin to natural disasters. But it's very clear that nations and communities are to be judged by their righteousness. What's more, righteousness is something that exists beyond faithfulness. Look, for example, at Cyrus of Persia, a polytheist who respected Yahweh as merely one among the many gods of the empire. Cyrus's messiahship makes the question of his salvation a bit complicated, but Persia is surely a more righteous nation in the scriptural account than Assyria or Babylon. The Ammonites of the Judges and Kings period were evil in a way that the Romans of Christ's time were not. And I mean, it's harder when you're living in the moment to evaluate modern countries objectively compared to how we're going to evaluate this historical moment 5,000 years in the future. But it's pretty clear that the Christian communities of the Near East have suffered from dhimmi status at best ever since the Muslim conquest of the region 1400 years ago. And they've suffered multiple rounds of genocide just in the last century, with this last only being the most recent. For all the talk of the great Muslim golden ages, each of them was enabled by the large secular and non-Muslim communities of these empires and ended by periods of Islamic resurgence. The Muslim world is poor and corrupt because it rests upon a wicked foundation. The only nice-ish places are propped up by oil wealth, and everywhere else is generating so much out-migration that the Christian and post-Christian West is witnessing an unprecedented surge of new entrants from there. To see the people who build such wretched civilizations war against peaceful Christian communities hurts the soul. To see nations who are generally morally equivalent, on the other hand, battling for dominance, that's also a tragedy, as lives are lost needlessly. But perhaps what I'm saying is this. Look at Ukraine. The people most worked up about that war, at least in the West, see Ukraine as a bastion of Western values being attacked by an evil dictatorship, and will often explicitly compare it to the Manichaean films and stories like Star Wars or Lord of the Rings, where good and evil is clear for all to see. The people least worked up about the war in the West are those who instead see one mid-sized, former, corrupt Soviet nation being attacked by a larger, corrupt, former Soviet nation. The value of the war is judged mostly by the stakes of the war. What will be lost and what gained should Ukraine be eaten by Putin? Is it a shining bastion, or is it just another post-Soviet hellhole? And nobody wants the Ukraine war. Not even Putin wants the war that he has. He wanted a 3-day special forces assault that was over before anybody could react, giving him a new country without having to break very much. He's stuck fighting the war now because it'll likely be an end to his reign, an end to stability in Russia, and an end to his life if he loses outright. Similarly, the Ukrainians don't want this war, and yet despite not wanting it, are fighting to the bitter end. Because war is not intrinsically evil. War is an exceptionally costly instrument. When that instrument is directed towards sufficiently good ends, it's a good thing to fight the war. When the instrument is directed towards evil ends, that war is an evil thing. More often, the ends are a bit more mixed and ambiguous, while the cost of war is always grim, and in our industrial society, it grows grimmer as our technology marches forwards. And so it's reasonable for us to assume that war is, in general, not worthwhile. It's reasonable for us to be extremely cautious before engaging with or supporting a war. But this ultimately is why I think I can be so very upset about the tragedy of the modern Muslim genocides against Assyrians and Armenians and Greeks and Jews, while at the same time being rather more neutral about the mixed record of the ancient Assyrian Empire, and even cautiously positive about the ancient Israel's following God's commands into the brutal aspects of the Canaanite genocide. Now, could I be wrong about this? I absolutely could be. I think the most cautious stance is to be anti-war in all but the most extreme of situations, especially in modern times. If God spoke to me and demanded that I start a worldwide war, now even if I was as certain as I could possibly be that it was a true religious experience, it is an open question if I should follow God's command or not. After all, a modern war would be so unthinkably costly, and there must surely be an upper limit to my own certainty of my own experiences. In probability terms, I may be 99% likely to be right, that it is a good thing commanded by God, but I must also be 1% likely, and practically speaking far more than 1% likely, to just be completely insane beyond my own awareness of it. And the cost of that 1% might seem to be far higher than any likely benefit that my own actions could cause on the 99% chance that I'm right. But I mean, that line of thought takes us into some other episode. Who knows when that'll happen. Anyway, God tells us nearly always to endure, not resist, and to live humbly and with grace, even in the face of persecution. With that general rule, very little violence can be justified without some greater divine command in view. Still, when evaluating the violence that does occur, either currently or in history, things seem to make more sense, at least to me, when focusing on the fruits of the event while acknowledging the costs. Now, this is far from the last word on the matter, and I have a lot more to ponder on related issues around historical ethics, but this is where I am at the moment, having been very worried about this discrepancy, but now somewhat confident that I'm reaching a reason for why the three genocides should in fact be treated as morally different things. Now, videos are slow at the moment on the channel because I'm building my own house and I'll soon be a father, but the videos will keep coming slowly for now, hopefully more in the future, so make sure you're subscribed and leaving comments down below to let us know your thoughts on these matters. I do appreciate your participation in this, the soft launch of the channel, but content will get more systematized and more regular someday, just not today. Until then, thank you for listening.